Schmidt, how did these interviews come to be?
I think that the major motivating factor for Kelly was Trump's recent comments about using the military domestically. Kelly essentially made a deal with himself when he stopped serving as Trump's chief of staff. And that deal was basically, if Trump said something that was wildly inaccurate, that related to something that Kelly was involved in, then he would speak out and clarify the record. Or if Trump were to say something that was potentially damaging to the country and really troubling, he would also speak out. And I've been trying to get John Kelly to answer these questions in a forum like this for a long time. But when Kelly saw the comments Trump made about using the military against Americans, for Kelly, that was a red line. And I think that John Kelly sees the divide between the military being something that defends the United States abroad and the military not being used on American citizens as something that is rooted in history that goes all the way back to George Washington. I think that Kelly, it's part of his ethos. I think that this was not something that he willingly did. I think that he struggled with the fact that he struggles with the same issue that bothers him about Trump. He struggles with the fact that I'm a retired, uniformed military officer weighing in on something related to a political event. This is someone who hates partisan politics, but I think was so bothered by the comments about using the military domestically that he felt a willingness to say essentially four things. One, I'm not endorsing anyone. I'm not telling you who to vote for, who I'm voting for. I am saying that I think character and fitness is really important, if not more important than policy. And I think you should know what I saw up close, and you should have some flavor of that. And I think obviously a lot has been written about Kelly. Kelly gave a statement to CNN a year ago. A lot was written in The Atlantic about Kelly. A lot's been written in books about Kelly by myself and by colleagues and at the Times and such. The difference here is the audio. The difference here is the audio. And as a reporter doing this, for several years, you start to realize that the written text, while really important and the bedrock of what we do, is only goes so far. And if you're trying to constantly find a new way to tell a story and to demystify the world to people, you have to look for other ways to come up with it. And in this case, it's hearing it from Kelly. There's nothing that Kelly says that is too different than, if you've been following the Trump story, the understanding of the Trump story. But here you have someone who is going on the record, who you can hear in his own voice. And I think that's the difference. I think that's what makes this, different than a text story. And
agreeing to be recorded and share the audio, just explain how that came to be and where you were when you first agreed to be recorded.
Well, I just asked him, I said, can I record this? And he said it was okay to record it. And then I came back to him and I said, look, we've recorded this. I think it's really important that not just people read what you have to say, but that they hear it. Because I think that, Kelly is bothered by the fact that Trump has denied losers and suckers, and that there was an effort in 2020 to push back on the Atlantic story. And Kelly didn't even realize it at the time that the Trump campaign had such a coordinated effort where they got these different people together to say that they never heard this. And it was only a few years ago that Kelly actually figured that out. And it really bothered him that Trump denied it, because I think to Kelly, it was an awful thing to say. And in some ways, I think it questioned, Kelly's credibility. So I said to him, I said, look, people need to hear it from you. It's a different thing to read something than it is to hear it. And we're going to do a story on this, but we're also going to publish the audio of it.
And he said, okay.
He said, okay.
And then he does 2 more recorded interviews with you. Let me play some more, because I think the important thing about losers and suckers is, to Kelly, That isn't even the most odious thing he says on the topic. I'll play that.
But he basically said to you that those who died for America on the battlefield were losers and suckers, and he said it more than once.
Yes, but he would he would say it would always that something else would get him going. Oftentimes, again, McCain. He talked about, and it was like almost a recording. But the point is, anyways, he would say it at times, sometimes unexpectedly, but he never could wrap his arms around why people would serve the country in uniform. What was in it for them? I think he just could never wrap his arms around why people would do things selflessly. What's in it for them? I think that's a much more powerful, but that's just me.
What's the significance of his lack of understanding of the entire concept of public service in Kelly's view?
I think it's that Trump doesn't understand sacrifice, and he doesn't understand a dedication to the country. It's actually rooted in, I think what Kelly would say is that Trump doesn't have an appreciation for the Constitution. He doesn't have an appreciation that if you're in the government or if you're in the military, you have taken an oath to the Constitution and that you don't serve an individual. And this starts with Trump early on in his presidency talking about my generals. I think that made the generals very uneasy. But it was the idea that the generals were loyal to their oath to the Constitution and they weren't loyal to Trump. And that the larger idea that there were people who made major sacrifices for this country that gave up limbs, that gave up their lives in defense of defending the United States. And Kelly says, including defending Donald Trump. And look, the thing that cannot be ignored in all of this is the most tragic part about this, and that is that John Kelly is the most senior American military officer to lose a child on the battlefield in the post 9/11 wars. And so you don't just have Donald Trump saying these things about sacrifice as he's walking through Arlington National Cemetery with Kelly through Section 60, where Kelly's son is buried. He's saying this to Kelly. He's not just a general who was out on the battlefield. This is a general who gave the ultimate sacrifice to the country in his son. And I don't know, I still don't know if I'll ever be able to wrap my head around all of that. And, I don't know.
Paul.
It's gut check time for America. And John Kelly is delivering a gut punch to Donald Trump that will resonate. And I think it's so significant that he's finally come out and spoken for people to hear his voice. This is what we've been waiting for. The only other shoe to drop might be Mattis, right? Mattis hasn't spoken publicly, I don't think, on the record extensively recently. And that would be another body blow to Trump in the final hours that would particularly resonate with independents in key swing states, many of whom are veterans. But I think I keep stepping back and watching how much this must be hurting because they're attacking him so ferociously. I just came from another network where a partisan governor just crapped on John Kelly like he was nobody. They're crapping on the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the former Secretary of Defense, even, Dick Cheney. I mean, they've all lined up in a circle around Trump, and they're saying the same thing. And John Kelly's son, Robert, was killed by a landmine in Afghanistan. And that has got to be what's motivating him in this moment to ring this bell for all Americans. I'm a father of two boys. The idea of them joining and losing them overseas is incomprehensible to me. But if that did happen, nothing would stand in the way of me telling the truth and communicating the sacrifice of my son to the American people. And that's what he's doing. And it's hitting hard. And he needs to go further. I think if Kamala Harris wants to deliver a closing argument next week, have him there, have Milley there, have McChrystal there, have Dick Cheney there, have Mark Esper there, have everybody in the defense community that has served with Trump and is now opposed to him, and remind everybody that they're gone, and that if Trump is elected, I talked to Tom Bowman in my podcast tomorrow, the Pentagon reporter for NPR, and he says that there are folks who've told him that they're going to leave the Pentagon. They're going to retire if Trump gets elected. The brain drain we will experience in our military is like nothing we've seen if this guy gets elected, except for the folks who will stay inside to try to do what Kelly and Mattis and others do, which is keep him in check. Imagine a world where Trump didn't have Mattis and Kelly and all these guys around him. That's the world we're going to have if he gets elected.